They came before sunrise, not from the land, not from the road, but from the sea. When the fog broke over the English coast in 793, the monks of Lindisfarne saw shapes gliding through the mist. Long, thin hulls cut through the gray water without a sound. No sails yet, no flag, only the rhythmic splash of oars. By the time anyone understood what they were seeing, it was already too late. The Vikings didn't announce themselves, they didn't march. They appeared. The first blow of the Viking Age wasn't a battle. It was a demonstration of speed, precision, and terror. The raiders were gone before the local militia even found their weapons. Lindisfarne was left in ashes, the first of hundreds to follow. To Europe, they seemed like ghosts from another world. But what they really were was the future. The term Blitzkrieg, lightning war, wouldn't appear for another 1,000 years. But in every sense that mattered, the Vikings had already mastered it. They were the first to understand that speed is strategy. That an army doesn't need to be large, only faster, more flexible, and more terrifying than the enemy expects. While the Franks and Saxons built walls, the Vikings built mobility. Their warships, long, narrow, and light, could slice through ocean waves or glide up rivers barely deep enough for a horse to drink. Each one was an amphibious assault platform centuries ahead of its time. They could strike, loot, and vanish before a defending army could even form ranks. Their raids were not random acts of savagery. They were targeted operations. Ports, monasteries, trade routes, every target chosen for maximum chaos and minimal resistance. The Vikings didn't just raid, they calculated. Their speed wasn't about luck, it was logistics. Imagine standing on a windy hill watching the horizon. No sails, no banners, just the rhythm of waves. Then, out of nowhere, oars flashing, hulls slicing the sea, an entire fleet materializes, silent as death. The sun glints off iron helmets and wet shields. The shore guards scramble, horns sound, but there's no time. The sea wolves are already running up the beach. And by the time you hear the first scream, it's over. They struck like lightning because they understood time. The Vikings used geography as a weapon, the same way modern armies use airfields and highways. Every inlet, every tide, every hidden current was part of their battle map. They turned nature into infrastructure. They didn't conquer the ocean, they weaponized it. When Charlemagne heard of the raids, he called them the wrath of God. But this was not divine punishment. It was the evolution of war. While kings gathered armies for months, the Vikings could launch within days. Their logistics were decentralized. Every village was a potential shipyard. Every man could fight, row, and navigate. The chain of command was short, the decision-making instant. It wasn't chaos. It was efficiency disguised as anarchy. That's what made them unstoppable. They had no fixed borders, no capital to burn, no calendar to obey. They were everywhere and nowhere. They struck from the sea, from the rivers, from the mist. And in every strike there was one clear principle. Arrive before they're ready. Leave before they recover. It wasn't written in a book. It was carved into their bones, the first doctrine of speed warfare. But their greatest weapon wasn't their ships or even their axes. It was their psychology. Every raid planted fear deeper than steel ever could. A monastery burned was a message. A city sacked and vanished overnight was a legend, one that spread faster than any army could march. The fear of the Vikings became its own form of warfare. a weapon of myth. Villages surrendered before the ships even appeared. They learned that sometimes you win without fighting at all, when the enemy fights his own imagination. And that's where their genius began. The Vikings weren't just raiders. They were early masters of operational speed. And Europe, for the first time in history, was completely unprepared for what came next. Before the Viking sword ever touched a shield, their true weapon had already been forged. The ship. Every empire has its symbol. Rome had the eagle, the Franks their cross, the Mongols their horse. The Vikings had the drakkar, a narrow-bellied, serpent-headed war machine that turned the sea into a highway and the land into prey. Forget the cliches of horned helmets. If you really want to understand how the Northmen conquered Europe, look at their ships. They were not just vessels. They were weapons of geometry. The drakkar's hull was long and shallow, made from overlapping oak planks that flexed with the waves instead of fighting them. This clinker construction gave the ship both strength and speed, light enough to be carried over land but sturdy enough to survive Atlantic storms. A crew could beach it, raid, and launch again within minutes. No deep harbor, no infrastructure, no waiting. That design broke the geography of Europe. Rivers were no longer barriers. They were arteries. The Vikings could row up the Seine to Paris, the Volga to the Caspian, the Dnieper to Byzantium. They appeared in places no army could ever reach. To the people they attacked, it was as if the sea itself had opened and spilled demons onto their fields. But this wasn't chaos. It was logistics. Each ship carried warriors, traders, carpenters, and scouts, a floating community of specialists, self-sufficient for months. They didn't just travel light, they thought light. Every man on board could fight, row, repair, and navigate. That made them faster than any standing army in Europe, and twice as unpredictable. Now imagine their coordination. A fleet of 50 ships sliding up a misted river, their oars beating like a heartbeat. No sound but wood and water. Each commander knew his role. Strike, burn, withdraw. No banners, no drums, no waiting for orders from a distant king. Just instinct and precision. What took European armies weeks of preparation, the Vikings could execute in hours. They didn't need a road network. They built their own, liquid highways that crossed kingdoms. The drakkar was not a tool for conquest. It was an instrument of velocity. Every component was designed for motion. The curved prow sliced through waves. The symmetrical bow and stern meant the ship could reverse direction instantly. No turning circle, no delay. It was the 9th century equivalent of a fighter jet executing a vertical climb. But their genius wasn't just engineering. It was tactical empathy. The Vikings understood what their enemies believed was safe. They struck where no one expected war to come from. A monastery, a port, a quiet town upstream. It wasn't brutality, it was data. Each raid was an experiment, a live test of enemy response time. They learned, adapted, and refined until they knew exactly how long it took for any kingdom to react. That's what makes them the prototype of modern rapid-strike warfare. They didn't just hit targets. They measured systems. How long before the bells rang? How fast could the local militia muster? Where were the rivers too shallow for pursuit? Every attack was a scouting report for the next one. To medieval Europe, this looked like savagery. To a strategist, it was pure intelligence work, reconnaissance in force. The psychology of speed became their doctrine. They rode in silence, struck with noise, and vanished with myth. Their enemies would ride for days to reach the smoking ruins, only to find the ships already miles away, gone with the tide, leaving legends behind. By the 9th century, Viking fleets were operating like synchronized strike groups. Some attacked coastal cities, others sailed inland at the same time to block retreat or spread panic. It was not random raiding. It was multi-axis warfare, coordinated across hundreds of miles without a single written order. A modern commander would call that distributed operations. And it all started with one idea. The ship is the army. The ocean is the battlefield. To this day, historians still underestimate what that meant. In an age where most armies moved 10 miles a day, the Vikings could cover 100. They could attack, loot, and disappear before scouts even confirmed their approach. The world had never seen that kind of reach, or that kind of fear. They didn't invent conquest. They invented mobility. And when speed becomes a weapon, you don't need walls, you need wings. Before the swords clashed, before the torches reached the walls, the battle was already over, inside the minds of their enemies. Fear was the first weapon of the Vikings, and they wielded it with surgical precision. They didn't invent terror, they industrialized it. When word spread that the sea wolves had been sighted, cities didn't mobilize, they froze. Merchants buried their silver, monks fled with relics, and whole villages abandoned their homes to hide in forests. No one knew where the next blow would fall, only that it would come fast and from nowhere. It's easy to see the Vikings as brutes, but that fear wasn't random. It was engineered. They knew exactly what stories the survivors would tell, and they crafted their image accordingly. They made sure that every raid was not just a victory, but a performance. Picture this: a misty dawn, a quiet monastery, the sound of waves. Then, horns. Not the neat signals of knights, but deep animal howls rolling across the shore. The first shape through the fog isn't a man. It's a carved dragon prow, painted red, its open mouth spitting spray. Behind it, a wall of shields glinting like teeth. To the villagers, it wasn't an army. It was the apocalypse. That's what the Vikings wanted. Every detail, the dragon heads, the painted shields, the battle cries, was psychological theater. They didn't just fight, they performed fear. Some chronicles claim that Vikings wore animal skins and smeared themselves with ash before battle. The berserkers, bear shirts. But this too was part of the spectacle. The berserker wasn't a warrior gone mad. He was a weaponized legend. By turning himself into something inhuman, he turned his enemy into prey. The screams, the foam, the blood on their faces, these weren't accidents, they were symbols. Each one said the same thing. We are not men. We are death in motion. To face that was to face inevitability, and inevitability breaks armies faster than steel. European commanders couldn't understand it. They measured power in castles, in knights, in banners. But the Vikings measured it in seconds. They didn't siege cities. They made cities surrender themselves. They didn't need to kill everyone, just enough to make the rest remember. Their raids became stories. The stories became legends. The legends became deterrents. By the time the next fleet appeared, resistance had already melted away. It was warfare through expectation. Every time the Vikings attacked, they left witnesses alive, deliberately. Those survivors spread tales that traveled faster than ships. They said the Northmen couldn't be killed, that their gods made them invincible, that they came for souls, not gold. And fear did the rest. The truth was more human and more brilliant. The Vikings understood narrative warfare before it had a name. They didn't need propaganda departments or printing presses. They used rumor as their ally and memory as their battlefield. They created a psychological map of Europe. Every place that remembered them was already conquered in the mind. And yet, for all the terror, they were methodical. They struck on market days, during festivals, on harvest weeks, when villages were full, unarmed, and distracted. They timed their attacks to the rhythm of their victims' lives. That's not savagery. That's strategic empathy. To destroy your enemy, you must understand his habits better than he does. The Vikings studied human predictability and used it against him. In one Frankish chronicle, a single sentence captures it all. They came without warning and left without trace, except for the silence that followed. That silence was their signature. They didn't occupy territory, they occupied attention. Every coast became a stage for their legend. Every survivor became an unwilling storyteller, spreading their myth further inland. That's why their empire was invisible. It existed in fear itself. Now imagine the strategic implications. While European kings built bigger castles, the Vikings made them irrelevant. Why siege a fortress when you can burn everything around it? Why fight an army when you can make the army afraid to leave its walls? They didn't need to win battles. They needed to win hesitation. And hesitation, once it infects command, kills kingdoms. By the late 9th century, even the great powers began to mimic Viking tactics. Small, mobile strike groups, decentralized command, shock maneuvers. What Europe learned too late was this: you can't stop what you can't predict. The genius of the Vikings wasn't that they fought well. It's that they understood what war really is. Not steel against steel, but mind against mind. They didn't conquer land. They conquered time, space, and belief. And before gunpowder, before Blitzkrieg, before the word psychological warfare even existed, they had already mastered all three. The day the Vikings appeared, war changed forever, because after them no commander could ever again feel safe behind a wall. By the 10th century, Europe thought the storm had passed. The great monasteries rebuilt their towers, the rivers buzzed again with trade, but what most never realized was that the Vikings hadn't vanished. They had evolved. The wolves of the sea were no longer just raiders. They had become architects of an empire with no borders, no palaces, and no walls. A network woven from rivers, trade routes, and fear. The genius of the Viking war machine wasn't brute strength. It was adaptation. Every failed raid was a lesson. Every river they explored became a data point. From Norway to Baghdad, they learned which cities paid ransom fastest, which ports had slow militias, which nobles would buy peace rather than fight. It wasn't chaos. It was early intelligence work. Modern armies call it logistics. The Vikings called it common sense. Their ships became couriers. Messages, spoils, hostages, and scouts flowed through a maritime web that connected the North Sea, the Baltic, the Volga, the Dnieper, and the Black Sea. Where others saw distance, the Vikings saw roots. In 860, their ships appeared before Constantinople, the greatest fortress in the known world. And somehow they had crossed half of Eurasia to get there. How? By mastering mobility as strategy. They didn't hold territory the way Rome had. They held movement. The real Viking Empire wasn't land. It was access. Every estuary, every market, every coastal village was a potential node in their network. They were the first civilization to weaponize connectivity. It's easy to picture them as wild men, but behind every raid was planning. And behind that planning, an invisible infrastructure that spanned continents. They had supply bases, refitting points, intelligence contacts. They understood tides, currencies, and human nature better than the kings who fought them. And they didn't need castles to control this system. They needed relationships. Where brute empires forced obedience, the Vikings offered profit. They were merchants as much as warriors. Gold from Baghdad, silk from Byzantium, furs from the north, everything passed through their hands. A Viking fleet could burn your town one year and trade with you the next. They made fear and commerce indistinguishable. You never knew if the sails on the horizon meant death or silver. That uncertainty was their shield and their leverage. Look at the pattern. By the mid-10th century, Viking leaders weren't dying on beaches. They were becoming kings. Rurik in Novgorod, Rollo in Normandy. Descendants of raiders turned into nobles not through conquest but through integration. That was the Quiet Revolution, when terror became diplomacy. Rollo didn't sack France. He negotiated it. The Franks gave him land in exchange for peace, and he turned it into Normandy. Land of the Northmen. From there, his descendants would later conquer England, bringing the Viking bloodline right into the heart of medieval Europe. But even this transformation was strategic. The Vikings knew that speed and flexibility weren't just for ships. They worked for ideas. They absorbed languages, religions, and technologies as fast as they conquered coastlines. They were pagans trading with Muslims, hiring Christian scribes, and serving as guards for Byzantine emperors. They adapted to survive, and adaptation is the ultimate form of strategy. What made their system unstoppable was its decentralization. There was no single capital, no bureaucracy to strike. Every chieftain was a node, every ship a decision-maker. If one fell, 10 others kept moving. That's how they lasted for centuries, not by strength but by resilience. Europe could defeat an army. It couldn't defeat a pattern. Imagine the map. From Iceland to Kiev, from the cold fjords to the golden domes of Constantinople, red lines snake like veins across the continent, each one a Viking route. They built no monuments, but they left behind something stronger, a system of movement that outlived their kings. Their empire had no borders, no senate, no law, and yet it worked, because it wasn't made of stone. It was made of momentum, and that's what made them the spiritual ancestors of every mobile army to come. They created the first networked warfare, the ability to strike anywhere, retreat anywhere, and yet remain everywhere. The world would see echoes of that in the Mongol horde, in Napoleon's core system, even in the modern concept of rapid deployment. But the seed, the original blueprint, was drawn on northern water 1,000 years earlier by men who built empires from waves. The Vikings didn't just change the way war was fought, they changed the way power was understood, not as territory, but as movement, knowledge, and speed. And that's why when Europe finally began to fight back, it wasn't enough to build armies. They had to build systems, because the Vikings had already shown the world a terrifying truth. Control doesn't come from what you hold. It comes from how fast you can move. By the end of the 11th century, the sea had grown quieter. The oars no longer beat like war drums across the North Sea. The dragon heads that once haunted coasts now stood as carvings in forgotten halls. And the same kingdoms that once trembled at the sight of northern sails now flew their own banners, stronger, unified, and ready. The storm of the Vikings had finally met something even more powerful: structure. The world they had reshaped began to turn against them. Europe had learned its lesson: adapt or perish. The kings of England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire had copied the very thing that once terrified them: speed, mobility, and coordination. They built navies. They fortified ports. They created early warning systems, signal beacons, coastal watches. They didn't fear the sea anymore, they had tamed it. What the Vikings invented, the idea that movement is might, had now been absorbed by their enemies. And just like that, the wolves became the hunted. The first cracks appeared not from a sword, but from within. The very freedom that made the Vikings unstoppable, independence, ambition, rivalry, began to tear them apart. Every chieftain was a king unto himself, every fjord a nation. Without a single unifying vision, the North splintered. The trade routes they once controlled now belonged to others. The Hanseatic League, the Normans, the Christianized monarchs they had unknowingly empowered. The sea that once carried their fleets now carried their conquerors. And then came the quiet invasion, not with fire but with faith. Christianity spread through the north like frost on steel. Kings converted to secure alliances, chieftains followed to keep their thrones. The old gods, Odin, Thor, Freya, became stories. And with them faded the spirit of the raids, that mix of fury, freedom, and fatalism that had driven their ancestors into the unknown. The cross replaced the raven, and the longhouse became a church. It was the perfect irony. The same Europe they had terrified now baptized them into its order. But the end wasn't defeat. It was transformation. The blood of the Vikings didn't disappear, it spread. Through Normandy to England, through Russia to Byzantium. Their sons ruled as dukes, kings, and emperors. Their ships gave birth to new fleets. Their tactics shaped new wars. When William the Conqueror, a descendant of Rollo, landed in England in 1066, it wasn't a raid. It was a precision strike. He didn't arrive to burn and vanish. He arrived to stay. And with that, the Viking way became something larger, a doctrine for the future. From then on, every empire would follow the same unspoken rule: move faster than your enemy can think. Napoleon would master it, Hitler would name it. But the Northmen lived it, 1,000 years earlier, with no maps, no radios, no mercy. They were the prototype of modern warfare, and the world never forgot their shadow. But not all stories end with fire. In the fjords, the last generations of Vikings laid down their axes and picked up plows. The sea wolves became settlers. Their sons built cathedrals where their grandfathers had burned monasteries. Their daughters wrote the sagas, epic poems of blood and sea and glory. So the world would remember the fury that once ruled the waves. One day, centuries later, archaeologists would unearth a rusted sword beside a warped piece of oak, the remains of a drakkar buried in the soil of a long-forgotten shore. And for a moment, under the gray northern sky, they would imagine it. The hiss of the tide, the flash of oars, and the thunder of voices rising from the fog. Because the Vikings never really vanished. They became the sea itself, silent, vast, and always waiting beyond the horizon.